Welcome to the most important thing, the show where we break down one key analytical metric or statistics for fantasy football in under 30 minutes. I'm Jay, and today we're diving into Sporq with our guest Ryan Heath from FantasyPoints. We're going to talk about what it is, where it came from, how to calculate it, how to use it, and why it matters. Let's go. All right, welcome everybody. Today we have joining us Ryan Heath from FantasyPoints. He's the lead data writer of FantasyPoints. If you want to find his content, you can find him on X at RyanJ_Heath. FantasyPoints is an awesome site. I'd highly recommend using it. The data suite they have there and the Dynasty tools and data tools that they have on the site can really help you win fantasy games. Ryan, in terms of what he does in season from an articles perspective, he's got the advanced mashups that comes out every week and the 5 stats to know coming out every week. In the off season, you get a ton of work from him. Articles covering so many data topics, including Fantasy Points Data 101 tutorials, statistically significant articles on metrics like first downs per route run, missed tackles forced per touched, weighted opportunity, many more, strategy guides, age curve articles, and so much more there from Ryan. So thanks so much for joining us, Ryan, or joining me, Ryan. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. How are you? Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. Excited to really get nerdy, get into all like I always love, getting nerdy into some stats, into some metrics today.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I have you on, because I really do admire your work out there. There's tons of great content that you can find from Ryan on X, and I'm so excited to dig in this. Into this particular metric. We recently had the combine, and so I think this is a perfect time to talk about this particular metric, Sporq. So Ryan, can you tell us a little bit about Sporq, where it came from, and how it's evolved in the analytics community?
Yeah, so Sporq is initially a Scott Barrett invention. Scott Barrett, CEO over at FantasyPoints. He initially created it basically because he wanted just an all-in-one athleticism metric that was both weighting all of the most important different events at the combine, but also to have it be in a way that is going to predict fantasy scoring, right? So kind of like a precursor to this, obviously, or kind of what the name is based off of, it is Sporq, right? That's the old Nike metric. But Scott wanted to kind of create his own version, again, make it relevant for fantasy and just make sure that we're appropriately weighting different events so it can be as predictive as possible. This is definitely not like the only composite athleticism metric that is kind of in the fantasy space, right? Hayden Winks had done his adjusted Sporq, which was very similar, or a similar idea. Obviously, relative athletic score, or RAS, is out there and is very popular. So it's kind of in the vein of all of these just composite athleticism metrics. So how I kind of came to Sporq this year is Scott Barrett came to me and he said, "Hey, I don't really feel like doing Sporq anymore. Can I just drop this on your desk this year? You can kind of retool it, remake it, do whatever you want with it. And you can just take this over." And I said, "Yep, that sounds good. I would love to go in and rip apart and rebuild your model, Scott." So yeah, now we have a fully updated version of Sporq through 2025. You can see all of the scores for Sporq over at fantasypoints.com. Just Fantasy Points Sporq. It'll pop up. It's free to view. Don't even need to have an account. So yeah, you can go check it out there.
Yeah, and just quickly, I know we're going to be talking about sort of these Sporqs. Is it a 1 through 100 scale for Sporq, or do you look at it more on a percentile basis? How are you thinking about when you get the actual number, how to think about it?
Yeah, so as soon as I get like the final output number, I just immediately run it through a percentile ranking, right? So any of the sports scores that I'm going to reference or that you see on fantasypoints.com, all of it is just a percentile rank. So if I say a 99 Sporq, that's just the 99th percentile rank in Sporq.
Yep. Yeah, perfect. So let's get into how to sort of, the explanation, the model of Sporq. And I think probably the best way to do it, as you did in your article recently released on Fantasy Points. Actually, I think it came out before the combine as well. But we're gonna look at the model explanation by positions, because each one of these positions is going to look a little different. So I grabbed the charts out of here, and the charts are really, really cool. And we're going to look at each of the positions and kind of talk about how you kind of formalize this model by position. But if you can look at this chart, it's got correlation, and that's measured by each of these combined measurements. So you got the 40-yard dash, speed score, vertical jump, broad jump, bench press, 3-cone, shuttle run. They're all there. And then it's the correlation to production in red and draft capital in gray there. So how have you put together this model? What are the most important metrics for running backs from that we're getting the testing data from the combine for? And then how does that kind of play into the model that you're creating for the running back position?
Yeah, so I mean, you can kind of see what is relatively more important or relatively more predictive up on the screen here. So yeah, obviously the 40-yard dash it is the most important here for running backs. We improve that predictiveness when we adjust it for weight using speed score. Originally a Bill Barnwell invention, like I don't know, 20 plus years ago, probably at this point. That's been a metric that's been around, but yeah, weight adjusted speed score, easily the most predictive, like single event that we can look at. Yeah, after that, the broad jump is relatively predictive. I found personally that also adjusting it for BMI would improve the predictiveness even further. So that's what I did within the Sporq model. And finally, I found that the 3-cone is, as you can see on the screen, third most predictive. And again, just adjusting that for weight would also improve the predictiveness. So those are kind of the three main variables in the model. And after that, it kind of comes to like a lot of smaller manual adjustments where I was just finding that if a player really, really excelled in something like the vertical or the bench press, then it did seem to at least moderately improve their production outcomes. So just kind of giving small bonuses for that, making sure that all my kind of best players are within a productive weight range for the NFL. So for those who don't know, there are very few examples of like very productive running backs that are lighter than about 197 pounds is right kind of where I ended up putting the cutoff. If you get a lot heavier than 247, 248, it also gets rough. Those guys are not necessarily like every down runners. Like if you're getting like bigger than Derrick Henry, basically, it's pretty much there's not a whole lot there. So yeah, that's kind of how I approach it. Just taking the most predictive stuff and kind of adjusting around the edges for anything else that I noticed, really.
Yeah, and the red bar, the production bar, what are you exactly measuring? Is that the best year of the first 3 years? Is that what production is?
Yeah, sorry, I probably should have said that right off the top, huh, when I
No, you're
went
good.
to
You're good.
explain it. But yeah, anytime I say production, with respect to this, it's just the best of the player's first 3 years, just by total PPR fantasy points.
Yeah.
And the reason that I use that is because I just think it's a really good proxy for a player's peak dynasty value, really. So if a player that is going to become valuable in dynasty, most of them are going to break out within the first 3 seasons of their career. There are like some exceptions to that, obviously, but for the most part, however much a player pops, like kind of in that initial phase of their career, is just going to be proportional to their dynasty value, or at least their peak dynasty value over their lifetime.
Yeah, that's perfect. Okay, so let's move on to wide receivers here. And can you tell us a little bit about what's sort of the difference here between wide receivers and running backs? I can immediately see on the chart that the bars are much smaller. The bars are a lot shorter in this one, and particularly the red bars. So the production bars are a lot smaller in this one. So yeah, what are some of the takeaways and how you built the wide receiver Sporq model?
Yeah, so I mean, we'll probably talk about this a lot throughout the show, but athleticism at the wide receiver position is just not that predictive, especially of production, right? But also of draft capital. Teams do care about receivers running fast. They will absolutely draft receivers that run really fast in the 40-yard dash, higher than they normally would otherwise. And honestly, to such an extent that it kind of creates a negative correlation between overall athleticism or Sporq and production, like within certain areas of the draft. So just because teams so relatively overvalue athleticism, which again, you can see based on how much bigger those gray bars are than those red bars, it just makes it really hard for us to build really any sort of functional athleticism model for wide receivers that isn't just ultimately predicting where they're going to get drafted. It's mostly predicting draft capital in the case of wide receivers. So kind of with that in mind, I wanted to kind of tune the model to one, finding which receivers teams are going to draft higher because draft capital is predictive of production, and also trying to like kind of filter out some of NFL teams like worst impulses when it comes to overdrafting receivers. So the way that starts is kind of by just splitting receivers into shorter and taller archetypes, just with 73 inches being my cutoff there. And it's not only because different events have different predictability for those archetypes, but mainly because all of kind of the worst draft busts are smaller receivers that ran really fast that teams drafted really, really high. Like these are your John Rosses, your Paris Campbells, like all of those, or actually not Paris Campbell, he was a round two guy, but yeah, John Ross certainly would be kind of like the prime example of that. So with that in mind, I just wanted to treat them differently in the model, and doing so, I think did help my predictiveness a little bit. So for the shorter guys, just using basically speed score, but also adjusting for height as well. Just kind of going with pounds per inch there. I found made it a bit more predictive. Also a weight adjusted 3-cone, very similar. For the taller guys, it just used normal speed score, as well as a height adjusted version of the broad jump. For all receivers, the vertical was at least moderately important. It also seemed like teams were very more willing to draft shorter receivers that had especially high verticals. So this might be like your Rondale Moores would be an example. And obviously Rondale Moore is not like an amazing production outcome, but he was a short receiver that got NFL draft capital, right? So these are kind of the things that are going into the model here. And then probably like the thing I feel best about is just really, I won't say heavily, but moderately penalizing receivers that fall under just a certain size cutoff. So we have very few productive NFL wide receivers that are below a 24 BMI. Since 2000, I think it's only Devontae Smith and Jamison Williams that have 1,000-yard seasons out of like 40 to 45 plus guys that have been drafted at that BMI or below. And also just receivers shorter than 5'10 generally seem to have worse hit rates, lower overall ceilings in the NFL. So those are just some ways that we can also improve the model's predictiveness by adjusting for that. So yeah, that's kind of overall what's happening at wide receiver. But yeah, again, like with wide receivers very specifically, I would just very much caution, like athleticism doesn't mean all that much. Teams especially overrate it. So I wouldn't, I'm not like more excited about Matthew Golden because he ran really fast at the combine.
So many like great names that came up through that discussion, right? John Ross, Rondell Moore. Rondell Moore is somebody that popped for me, not only because super athletic draft capital, but he also had a really good freshman year at Purdue, production wise. So he had an early breakout as well. Sad that one didn't work out. I'm still sad that one didn't work out as I thought it would. Yeah, let's go into tight ends here. And tight ends, I think you'll echo this. The bars are probably the highest here. I think athleticism generally for tight ends is a lot more predictive over most of the other positions. I think we saw a couple of high bars, particularly on speed score for running backs, and you walk through us through the models. But I think tight ends historically, athleticism has been something that's really helped in terms of predicting fantasy production. So what did you take away from your Sporq model on the tight ends? Like, how are you bracketing this? A lot higher bars here on the scale. The bars are going up higher, and then the reds are almost as high as the draft capital production, or the draft capital piece at bars as well. So, just sort of, what are your thoughts here on the tight end model, and what are some of the considerations you had?
Yeah, so I think I definitely will echo what you just said. Athleticism is by far the most important at the tight end position. We will even see teams like underrate it with specific prospects sometimes, and you can definitely take advantage of that. Like tight end more than any other position is where I really pay attention to athleticism and don't just kind of like sit back and trust the teams to figure it out like via draft capital. Like I think you can very much get an edge on the NFL. By looking at athleticism, because yeah, they don't like so dramatically overrate it as they do with wide receivers or even with running backs sometimes. So yeah, getting into the model, I think like the number one mistake that people make with tight end athleticism in general is just not distinguishing between there's a lot of different types of tight ends in the NFL. Obviously, we can talk about like a move tight end or an inline or tweeners or all these different archetypes, but just very simply, guys that should be expected to catch passes and guys who should never be expected to catch passes is kind of the distinction that I just want to make, since we're concerned with fantasy football production, right? So I found that 265 pounds was like the most logical cutoff just based on the production histories of those two groups. If you're over 265 pounds, incredibly unlikely that you're going to make any sort of fantasy impact. Almost all of those guys are pretty much just pure blockers. So I didn't want like the heavy guys and all of their measurables like biasing what I'm looking for the actual potential fantasy contributors. So I just split them up in the model, and they have completely different weights for each of them, basically. So for the lighter guys, for the fantasy relevant guys, speed score is the biggest thing. Again, a weight adjusted version of the 3-cone drill I found to be fairly predictive. One of like the best weight adjusted 3-cone tight ends ever was Jimmy Graham. If we're just talking about like hyper athletic tight ends, that is one of the better examples. Converted to the position, and then within like a year just was absolutely destroying the NFL. And then also the broad jump I found was predictive for the lighter guys. On the heavier guys, the vertical and the shuttle were most predictive. But again, like I just don't care that much about the heavy tight ends. All of them are kind of just penalized from the start in the model because, yeah, again, really poor production outcomes for the guys over that threshold. So yeah, that's like basically an overview, I guess, of the model with tight ends. If they're too light, I also penalize them, just because I guess I should talk about this a little because it's kind of relevant with some of 2025's prospects. Tight ends below about 230. I think Evan Engram at 234 is like the lightest example of a genuinely productive NFL tight end we have. Below that, it gets really tough. And that's because like the tight end position is fundamentally about mismatches, right? So it's great if you are a tight end on like a linebacker and you're faster than him and he can't keep up with you. Perfect. You're hyper athletic. That's a mismatch. Safety's on you. Oh, you're way bigger than him. Even better, right? But if you get to like wide receiver size, essentially. So like 230 or below, or 6'3" or below. Now you're literally just like a worse slot receiver, essentially. And you're not like really taking advantage of those mismatches. You're probably not as good of a route runner as most slot receivers are, and you're probably not going to get on the field over most NFL team slot receivers. So that's kind of like the dilemma that we have with some of these prospects this year. Like you saw Harold Fannin and Oren Gadsden both way over 240. Fannin did not run well, and Gadsden didn't run. My suspicion is that their actual playing weight in college was probably a lot lower than 240. And that kind of speaks to, just sort of like what we're looking for weight-wise for a tight end to fit into. Those guys, these prospects try really hard, obviously, to show teams what they want to at the combine, but it shows up in their poor testing or them not testing at all.
Yeah, Gadsden's a particularly interesting example because, he was a wide receiver to start, and they converted him to a tight end, but it was more of like a gimmicky type of classification, and now he's trying to be a tight end. So I don't know, pretty interesting story. But 3-cone is the only one that kind of stands out to me in terms of tight ends and running backs, but to a lesser degree that is better than draft production prediction is better than draft capital prediction there. So I think that's also interesting. So now for tight ends, I think we're going to go through sort of an example here on how to calculate the tight end Sporq score. But remember, we're talking about tight ends less than 265 here, and then we're going to use speed score, weight adjusted 3-cone, and broad jump here. But if you were to take this, sort of Sporq calculation for the tight ends, you can use sort of a theoretical player, an actual player. How would you kind of walk somebody through that particular calculation?
Yeah, so we can just use Jalen Conyers as an example. He had the top Sporq score among tight ends at the combine in 2025. So yeah, he is under 265 pounds. So he goes into that sort of bucket using that set of metrics. So his speed score, which again is just weight adjusted 40-yard dash time, is in the 64th percentile among all of my qualifying tight ends. So this is any tight end that's run the 40-yard dash at the combine since 2000. Conyers in the 64th percentile speed score in that group. Then we look at the weight adjusted 3-cone. So whenever I say like weight adjusted for 3-cone or broad jump or whatever, all I'm doing is just making a linear model, finding like an expected value of a player's 3-cone time based on their weight and comparing the actual time against that, right? So that's just telling us like if Jalen Conyers is relatively heavier than his 3-cone than most of the tight ends who run similar 3-cone times, he gets like extra points for that, right? Because it's harder to run a fast 3-cone at a heavier weight. That's all we're doing, is just giving additional credit and context for each of those performances. So in the weight adjusted 3-cone, Jalen Conyers ends up in the 91st percentile among our sample. And then in the broad jump, he ends up in the 76th percentile. So we've got those three percentiles, the 64th, the 91st, and the 76th. I weight speed score the most. So I just, however I want to weigh all of those, if it like 3x, 2x, 1x, or what have you. Obviously, for every position, I'm kind of mixing these up and experimenting and finding what's most predictive. But I basically take those percentiles, weight them appropriately, average them together, and then I get like a number that means nothing to anybody until we percentile it out from a nice clean 0 to 100. And then I'm making manual adjustments, like for size or whatever it is at each position. If I'm giving out bonuses for certain events, manual adjustments, percentile it all up, and then you've got a Sporq score. And for Conyers, I think he was an 88, an 89, something like that.
That's a really high Sporq score. Not quite in the 90th percentile, but that's great. And 89 percentile is pretty great. Okay, so now that we kind of sort of know how the model works. Now let's kind of get into why it matters. Before we dive into, we're going to look at each of the positions here. But before we dive into running backs in particular, would you describe Sporq as sort of descriptive or predictive? And if you were, here's the question, why would you prioritize Sporq over any of the other metrics out there?
Yeah, so I would prioritize Sporq over something like Spark. I don't want to like say it's better than RAS or whatever, because I haven't worked with RAS or any of the like the more modern kind of versions of these composite scores. But I guess I'll just say like composite athleticism stuff in general. It's definitely, it is descriptive, right? So it does a good job of just putting players on a spectrum and from 0 to 100 or what have you, whatever your spectrum is. In Sporq's case, it is predictive to some extent for some positions. So the running back position at like the upper extremes, like 90th or better percentile, we do see better production outcomes even after we control for draft capital, right? It's not as important as draft capital, especially at the wide receiver position. Sporq or athleticism is nowhere near as important as draft capital or like production metrics, but it can be a piece of the puzzle when we're prospecting, right? But it's very important. I guess I wouldn't say like you prioritize it over any other metric, but it's always a piece of the puzzle. This is just kind of how I look at prospecting in general. There aren't like metrics that I think are just better than others. Like we should never look at one metric over another. That might have been a bit of a word salad, but hopefully that made some sense.
No, I think that's actually perfect. That's the way I always kind of describe it. It's a piece of the puzzle. It helps you get there. And draft capital probably having much more higher correlation than a lot of these things. But if you combine draft capital with production plus maybe athleticism, kind of add all that stuff in, maybe you get to even a better result. So, let's talk about sort of why it matters for running backs. And this first chart you have up here, really cool. Again, this is in the article that you wrote, but we got three things kind of going here. We got the Sporq percentiles on the top. We got the draft capital on the left. So day 1, day 2, day 3, UDFA. And then in the boxes, we got the fantasy points peak in years 1 through 3. And you can kind of see the green, the darker green is kind of where you want to be. And then yellow and red is a little bit less. But, can you just kind of describe what this chart is telling us, this top chart is telling us here from, why the Sporq matters and how it can help get you a productive running back?
Yeah, so let's start just by looking at the top row. So day 1, these are running backs drafted on day 1 in round 1. The first thing you'll notice is that there is no data for running backs on day 1 below the 25th percentile in Sporq. That's because teams recognize the importance of athleticism and they generally don't draft these horrifically unathletic running. I don't want to say horrifically unathletic. All these guys are more athletic than me, to be clear. But they don't draft these relatively unathletic running backs on day 1. And you can see in the 90th percentile, we have the best average production outcomes among day 1 running backs, right? And as you kind of go down each like percentile bucket, the 90th to 75th and the 75th to 50th, those are kind of similar, like kind of in the middle range of Sporq. But as you get below the 50th percentile, it's like, okay, their average production really starts to fall off, especially compared to that 90th or better percentile bucket. So yeah, I think with Sporq for running backs in particular, it's important to remember that it's not just like a linear scale, or it is a linear scale from 0 to 100, but it's not like evenly important throughout the entire thing, right? It's really like these polar extreme outlier ends. There's not that much difference between like an 85th percentile Sporq and your expectation for them or a 50th percentile. Like it's all fairly similar. It's just really like those outlier guys you want to zero in on. Day 2, it's kind of similar. We don't see like that huge spike for the hyper athletic guys on day 2, but especially as we get below the 25th percentile, we see the production really start to fall off. And then similar in day 3 as well. But yeah, kind of like the big takeaway here when you're looking at this is like, well, the draft capital like it is clearly more predictive than Sporq is. And I would never I would never deny that. That's why I think it's really important, especially this time of year before we know a player's draft capital, just to keep in perspective like how little we currently know. Like we have production metrics which are not like on this matrix at all. We have athleticism metrics, but just a huge piece of the puzzle, at least if we're trying to predict fantasy points as best as we can, is currently not available to us, or at least not like confirmed. We can definitely make guesses about players' draft capitals. We can do a decent job of that with like consensus mock drafts and stuff. But it's, yeah, just keep in mind, we don't know all that much yet.
Yeah, I agree. And this for this bottom chart is the rate of RB1 seasons in the first 3 years. And it looks like if you're in the 75th percentile or higher, that really kind of maximizes your odds of achieving in one of those first 3 years an RB1 type season. Anything else to add to that sort of chart?
Yeah, I'd just say with that bottom chart, to keep in mind that, yeah, like we see that great predictiveness just off of Sporq, but that bottom chart doesn't have like the draft capital axis, right? So like a lot of the work that is being actually done there is teams tend to, those 75th or better percentile running backs tend to get drafted on day 1 and day 2 instead of on day 3. So that is like, yeah, so you can see it broken out in more detail with that axis up at the top. But yeah, that's just stuff to keep in mind, I guess.
Yeah. Okay. And then let's move on to wide receivers. And I think we touched on this when we were talking about the wide receiver model and sort of the negative correlation. But as you can see in day 1, if you go to the below 20th percentile, that's the darkest green, the highest fantasy points number there. So talk to us about sort of what's going on there. Why is that happening? And what can we take away from that?
Yeah, so thinking back to the original chart we had with like the red and the gray bars, you notice that the wide receiver gray bars, so the athletic testing was predicting draft capital a lot better than it was predicting production. And this is kind of the consequence of that, with teams very much wanting to draft like these highly athletic wide receivers a lot higher than they normally would, given all of their other traits, right? So I think the NFL for a long time has kind of had an issue with de-emphasizing the route running, the separation abilities, the contested catch abilities, like the football IQ stuff at the wide receiver position, in favor of just like the raw athleticism. And yeah, as I mentioned, like a lot of those just really fast raw athletes have horrible track records, like compared to their draft capital. So in day 1, what you're seeing is kind of on average, the more athletic a wide receiver is in like just in like the sense of pure athleticism, what Sporq is measuring, probably the lesser of a like wide receiver they are in every other aspect, from like a skills perspective, right? I mean, like you have the crazy outliers at the very top, like Calvin Johnson has the best wide receiver Sporq score ever, but he obviously kind of puts together like all of the amazing skills at the receiver position. Plus, he's the freakiest athlete the NFL has ever seen, pretty much. So like there are guys that have both that go like first overall or in the top 5 overall picks, but round 1 wide receivers as a rule, probably if you weren't all that productive and got drafted in round 1, it's because you were super athletic. And yeah, production mattering more than athleticism, we just end up with this negative correlation within the rounds. This is called Bergson's paradox. Adam Harstad has like the best explanation of this from like 5 years ago, kind of like he always does for anything that's complicated, kind of conceptually like that. So go check out Adam Harstad. I linked to his original explanation in my article as well. So yeah, shout out Adam Harstad. But yeah, aside from that, I think you can look at this and say, okay, well, on the bottom, Sporq can clearly predict at least decently, which wide receivers are going to be drafted higher, because those are the ones that are having the wide receiver 1 level seasons in their first 3 years. But yeah, once we break down by draft capital, it's pretty clear that NFL teams are like more than taking all of the edge out of evaluating athleticism for us. So yeah, with that in mind, I just don't care that Matthew Golden ran really fast and that he's going to go in the first round. That's why he's going in the first round. Like I don't need to double count those things within my own process.
That's a great perspective. No need to double count. That's something we hear all the time. If you're looking at the numbers, if you already know he's super athletic, we don't need to count it twice. And then finally here, still like the odds of a wide receiver one season drop off substantially the worse they score in Sporq. So you're still getting a little bit of odds of a wide receiver one season, the higher Sporq is, even with some of those things we talked about before. So now going on to tight ends, the meat of this, because we know Sporq matters the most for tight ends. We saw it in the gray and red bars, and then we see it again here in this chart. So talk to me about why it matters the most for tight ends here in this process.
Yeah, so kind of the biggest thing that should immediately jump out to anybody looking at this top chart is that the day 2 tight ends that are hyper athletic, so 90th percentile Sporq or better, are having pretty similar production outcomes to the day 1 tight ends that are very athletic, right? So that kind of tells us that especially with like a deeper tight end class, but like we thought we had this year. I'm a little less sure about that now, but there are certain tight end classes where guys are falling into day 2, right? And we can at least say from this research that if they're hyper athletic by Sporq, even if they fall to day 2, they still have very high NFL ceilings. So that's kind of like, that's probably like number 1 most actionable takeaway is like, I don't think that this is happening, but if like, I don't know. Instead of a hypothetical, I'll use actual players. A Travis Kelce or a Rob Gronkowski, both 90th percentile plus Sporq players, fell to day 2. Obviously, we saw their ceilings for years in the NFL, right? Jimmy Graham, another example. Just there's lots of these hyper athlete day 2 tight ends that have been massively successful, or as successful as the day 1 guys. So that's really the biggest like thing I want people to take away. And then also, I guess, just when it comes to predicting draft capital, these like below average athletes at the tight end position are very rarely getting significant draft capital, right? We saw Gunnar Helm go out and like bomb the combine. It looked like he had an injury, so maybe that all changes if he runs better at his pro day. But for now, Gunnar Helm's in like a 12th, 13th percentile Sporq. That's probably going to like nuke him down into day 3 if that were to stand, would be my guess. So yeah, I guess that those are the biggest things. It's just that tight end is really where we can start to kind of break from draft capital a little bit if we have that hyper athleticism. But yeah, unfortunately, there are no real examples of this in this year's class. We don't have anybody above a 90 Sporq score in this class, which was very disappointing to me. I don't know. Tyler Warren, Elijah Arroyo, and Colston Loveland, none of them tested. So I would not have been surprised if all 3 of them hit that. But yeah, we'll probably have to wait for pro days to find out.
Yeah, that's perfect. And if you're, I guess in this particular case, there aren't any examples of you taking a day 2 tight end in your fantasy draft based on Sporq. But in the future, if you're sitting in your 2nd round or 3rd round and you're looking to take a tight end, and you can use Sporq as sort of a way to kind of filter out some of the guys, and that production that you get from him might be as good as if he especially was in the 90th percentile, as good as something you get from a day 1 tight end with a similar athleticism. So that's exciting. That really does mean a lot in a position where It's really tough to judge through college because there isn't a lot of production besides the few examples like Brock Bowers or some of the other guys. Tight ends don't get used all that often in college offenses, so the production is a lot harder to come by. And this is definitely a position where we can kind of pair draft capital plus the Sporq or athleticism together to get you a pretty good idea of what that player will be. So let's move on to some quick examples of how to kind of use this. We recently had the combines. Can you talk about some of the takeaways you had from the 2025 combine? I mean, you've threaded some of these in through here, but just sort of the major takeaways, either by position or some of the players that you've seen, and how you think how we've gone through the explanation, how we've gone through why it matters, and how to apply that to the 2025 combine, guys.
Yeah, definitely. So I think the biggest thing that immediately jumps out is that this running back class is amazing. So I was a little bit more on like the skeptic end of people like comparing this running back class to like 2017 and oh my God, it's so deep. I still don't think it has all the elite talent that 2017 did, but it definitely from a depth perspective, there are a lot of really interesting running backs now. 6 running backs above a 90th percentile Sporq score at the 2025 combine. I don't think we've ever seen a year with more than 4. Most years average like 1 or 2 guys that are hitting that 90th or better percentile. So that really did help me feel a bit better about the depth of this running back class. It definitely makes it more likely that some of these guys are going to hear their name called before the end of day 2. Like now, I would not be surprised if like an RJ Harvey or a DJ Giddens were getting day 2 draft capital. That would be helping the class overall. Same with Bashal Tutin, of course. Those 3 guys, I would have pretty significant interest if they get pulled up into day 2. And then obviously kind of the 2 other big winners that we already knew were good prospects, but could be pushed up even further into day 1 potentially because of their combine testing. Omarion Hampton, as well as Quinshon Judkins, who was a lot faster and jumped a lot further than I kind of expected him to, or than I think a lot of people kind of expected him to. Much like better, just like pure athlete than I think a lot of people thought that he looked at least last year. So all of that's awesome. Like the running back class seems very deep. I mean, not all these guys are going to get the ideal landing spots. This is kind of like the perfect time of year where we can just envision all the best outcomes for all these prospects while they're so athletic. One of them's going to probably go to the Seahawks or the Packers or whatever. Like we've gotten disappointed definitely in the past. Would expect that with some of them, but yeah, just from a depth perspective, really into the running backs. That was my biggest takeaway. And then kind of my other takeaway is I just want to talk about Harold Fannin a little bit at the tight end position. So he was probably the one I was most interested in of any player to see how he would weigh in and how he would test, just because of how insane all of his production has been over his college career. And I was pretty disappointed. I alluded to earlier that I kind of think that his playing weight was probably around 230 pounds, give or take, which is much lighter than a typical NFL tight end than the NFL's looking for. He bulked up to, I think it was 241 at the combine. And then he ran relatively slow. He was still really good in the weight adjusted 3-cone. That did help his Sporq score some, but he only ended up in the 67th percentile. And again, we know that NFL teams care more about the 40 than they do the 3-cone. So kind of all of that taken together just makes it very unlikely to me that Fannin is going to get that like top 50 draft capital that I would have really wanted to see out of a player like that. Just because from like a prospect perspective, I don't think a lot of teams are convinced that he can be like a functional inline blocker at all. He's probably just going to be like one of these tight end in name only types. And that's getting like a lot harder to succeed that way in the league of late. There's really only it's basically just like Brock Bowers and Mark Andrews that are almost never in line and like get away with a near full-time route share. Andrew's not even so much this past year. So yeah, just all of these kind of concerns are piling up for me with Harold Fannin. I mean, I'll change my mind pretty instantly if a team surprises us and takes him like really early day 2. But yeah, him just I was ready to like plant the flag if he came out as a 90th percentile or better, just pure athlete at 240 pounds, but that wasn't the case, unfortunately. So he's somebody that I'm just a bit lower on now after the combine.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then in terms of using Sporq, what are sort of the limitations? I noticed like in your article we didn't talk at all about quarterbacks. So like, are we talking about Sporq and quarterbacks? I mean, I don't think we even get enough quarterbacks testing at the combine to really come up with something here that matters, or that's athleticism matters all that much for QBs in general. But what are your thoughts on Sporq for QBs? And then we talked about it as being sort of a piece of puzzle, but like, what are the other limitations to this? I mean, for the most part, we talk about how it has to kind of be combined with other things, or just being part of the piece of the puzzle. But do you see any other limitations? Anything out there come to mind?
Yeah. So first with QBs, a lot of QBs aren't like running all the athleticism drills at the combine. A lot of QBs just aren't participating at the combine at all, even like the throwing drills at this point. So that's obviously one problem. Another problem is that quarterback prospecting, in my opinion, is just the hardest in general, especially from like a numbers and data driven perspective. I think it's easily the toughest position to scout. Probably from a film perspective too, but I know less about that side of things. But yeah, I mean, my co-host over on Dynasty Points on the FantasyPoints channel, Thomas Tipple, he always says only God can scout quarterbacks. Like I'm just going to take the quarterbacks that the NFL are taking in the first round in like our Dynasty Superflex leagues and not worry about it. And it usually works out based on cost, and that's true. So yeah. And like the final issue with quarterbacks is that a quarterback running like a fast 40 time doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually going to run a lot in the NFL. You're going to see that more just from, are they scrambling in college is going to be the biggest thing. And a lot of the time, whether they continue to do it in the NFL is going to be dependent on their play caller, on the system. Do they actually want this quarterback staying in the pocket or scrambling all over the place and bailing? So it's just a much more like individualized kind of thing that I think at least would be a lot harder to model. I say that without having tried a ton, but that's why there's no QB Sporq scores, basically, is all those reasons. General limitations, I would just kind of echo some of the things I've been saying and emphasize them here. So the combine at all positions, especially wide receiver, especially running back, it's mostly about predicting draft capital, right? Teams definitely care a lot about athleticism. We saw that from all of those charts we showed earlier. And they're going to factor that into where they're drafting players. So it's important, again, not to double count stuff. Sporq, athleticism, all of that matters most at kind of the polar extremes, like that 90th percentile or better. It's not just evenly distributed with like an 85th percentile guy being so much better than a 50th percentile guy. It all kind of blends together in the middle. And then finally, like your draft capital obviously is going to matter a lot more than Sporq in isolation, but also like your production metrics, especially at a position like wide receiver. College production and efficiency is just much more predictive of NFL success than athleticism. So just, yeah, keeping in mind that Sporq it's cool. I enjoy working with it. It's really fun to like do all of these comparisons between different guys, but it should not be like the full centerpiece of your prospecting journey or of your process.
Awesome. Really appreciate that. And we're going to wrap things up here, but if you've been hanging in here and getting to the end, we're at almost 50 minutes and I promised 30 minutes. Too long didn't read. If there's one thing people should take away from using Sporq, the Sporq metric in general, what is that?
Yeah, so just athletic testing Sporq matters a lot at tight end. It matters some at running back at the extremes, and it just basically doesn't matter at all for wide receivers. And just make sure you're not double counting after the NFL has told us what they think of these prospects and their athleticism via their draft capital.
Yeah, wonderful. And Ryan, thank you so much for joining me here today. Again, Ryan, you can find Ryan's work on X at RyanJ_Heath, and all of his great stuff at FantasyPoints. And you guys do YouTube shows all the time, go live. So yeah, go follow Ryan anywhere you can find him. And then if you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, or drop a comment below. And see you next time on The Most Important Thing.